Hi, I'm Beau Legouge, and this is Learning to Turn. Since this is the first episode in this series, let's spend a few minutes talking about the purpose of these videos. The first thing you should know is that we're in this together. Actually, that may be assuming facts not in evidence. I have no way of knowing why you're watching, whether you're here to learn to turn. But I am. See, the thing is, I don't really know what I'm doing with this tool and this machine. I'm not completely clueless. I have what you might call book learning, and I've dabbled at turning a few times over the past 3 decades since my dad got his first lathe, but not nearly enough to develop any real skill or to feel remotely comfortable or confident standing here with a gouge in my hand and a piece of wood spinning at 1,000 RPM. Well, about 2 years ago, I decided to change that, to commit myself to learning how to do this right. Some other time I might tell you why it took so long, but for now I'll leave it at this. Over the past 21 months, I've done a lot of preparation on various fronts. But one thing I haven't done is to actually start turning. I've been saving myself for this day, preserving my wood-turning virginity, you might say, so that these videos would legitimately chronicle my journey from genuine beginner to hopefully a competent intermediate turner. Which brings us in a slightly roundabout way to the first guiding principle for this series, that one can learn from watching a newbie practice a skill. Learn things that you're not likely to get from seasoned veterans because they don't make rookie mistakes, and they might not think to talk about common stumbling blocks. No risk of that here. The big unknown is whether I'll be able to find my way around the stumbling blocks that I will inevitably run into. If not, then this series may be much shorter than planned. My other guiding principle is that skills rule. That can be read in 2 distinct ways, both of which have truth. First, that mastery of technique is paramount. But that might be better stated as skill rules, and you may recall that what I said is skills rule. Phrasing it in the plural gets to the second meaning and the one that I intend. See, turning a bowl involves a number of different types of cuts. 8 to be precise. Each type of cut requires its own technique, and in 2 cases a different tool. So in a very real sense, turning a bowl entails 8 separate essential skills. In this second sense of the phrase, the word rule also has a different meaning. The first way of reading it, rule meant that skill was paramount, that metaphorical coin of the realm. Here I'm using it in the sense that the 8 essential skills dictate the structure of this series, which provides a decent segue to how I designed the series. Having watched a fair number of turning videos on the web, my impression is that they're geared toward intermediate to advanced turners. I didn't find any that were made for beginners like me. A concise, comprehensive demonstration of the various cuts. If you happen to know of any such videos, please point me to them. Anyway, this is the hole I aim to fill, and to do it, I'll be focusing each episode on one type of cut, or in a couple of cases, 2 related cuts. Here's a preview. This episode will cover flattening the end that will be the top of the bowl and cutting a recessed tenon for mounting on the chuck. Episode 2 will be on roughing the blink down to a cylinder. 3 will be about shaping the exterior of the bowl, which takes 2 types of cuts, and forming a different type of tenon for mounting the bottom end in the jaws. 4, and possibly 5, will cover hollowing out the inside, which has 2 phases, each using a different tool, hence the possibility that it will be split into 2 episodes. The last episode will involve mounting the bowl on a jam chuck to thin the outside, remove the tenon, and form the base. At the start of the segment on each skill, we'll go over a set of specifics like foot position, left-hand position, tool angle, flute angle, plus, of course, the technique for making the cut. Then I'll commence to practicing over and over until I get the hang of it. Don't worry, no matter how long I spend practicing, I'll edit it down to a reasonable length, but I'll keep all the good parts. Now, this seems like a good point to address the elephant in the room. Since by my own admission, I'm no more than a wannabe at this, you'd be daft not to question how I came by what I referred to before as my book learning. and whether you can trust that I took good notes. In short, why should you put any stock in what I have to say on this topic? So everything I learned over the past year and change came from watching videos. It's safe to bet my videos are not the first on the subject that you've watched, so I don't have to tell you that there's no shortage of turning videos online. In my experience, most aren't instructional in any meaningful way. I almost suspect that their intended audience is not fellow turners, but rather people who are fascinated by watching a lovely object emerge from a block of wood by a wave of this magic wand. Only a handful of videos that I found qualify as serious attempts to teach the craft, and as I said before, not many of them spoke well to me as a beginner. So I felt fortunate that pretty early on I stumbled on a 90-minute demonstration to some turning club by a guy named Stuart Batty. It instantly clicked with me for two reasons. First, Mr. Batty has a gift for not only describing what he's doing, but also explaining why the subtleties of his technique really matter, and what goes awry when you get it wrong. Second, his technique and the grind of his gouge allow him to remove a half-inch of wood in a single pass, and produce a nearly perfect finished surface in the process. That is truly magical to a guy like me who, in my very limited experience, struggled to take off a millimeter of wood at a time and left the piece looking like it had been gnawed by beavers. After finding that first Stuart Batty video, it was like, no more entries please, we have a winner. Seriously, I pretty much stopped watching stuff by other turners and instead scoured the web for anything featuring Mr. Batty. My haul, 2 more feature film-length recordings of presentations and a series of about 30 videos, most of them 10 to 20 minutes in length, that he posted on Vimeo 7 years back when he had his own tool company. They're an absolute goldmine, especially the Vimeo set, which is organized around what he calls the 7 fundamentals of wood turning, such as wood grain, lathe speed, stance, and the importance of sharp tools. I've watched them all more than once, and the last time I took fastidious notes. So the more precise answer to the first question about where I learned what I think I know is Stuart Batty. Which brings us to the second question. Why should you trust that I took good, accurate notes? Well, for one thing, I have a PhD in history. While that's of no consequence for this job and tells you nothing about anyone's intellectual prowess, you can at least trust that I have plenty of experience taking notes. But the answer that should really give you confidence that I got it down right is again Stuart Batty himself. About a month ago, as I finished harvesting every detail I could from his videos, I worried whether I'd done a good enough job, whether my notes were a sound foundation for this whole endeavor. Who better to ask, I thought, than the man himself? I had come across his email address online, so I figured, what do I have to lose? I dropped him a note, introducing myself, explaining my mission, and asking if he'd be willing to review my notes. He graciously agreed to do so, and a week later we chatted for more than an hour. Funny part is that we spent none of that time talking about my notes or more broadly about technique. He assured me I had nailed it right down the line, so there was nothing to correct or clarify. Now how's that for a seal of approval? And now that I have both his email address and his cell phone number, I feel comfortable calling him Stuart from here on out. And trust me, you'll be hearing his name a lot. One last topic before I shut up and start turning. Let's talk a little more about the intended audience for these videos and my main objective for them. When Stuart saw the level of detail in my notes, he assumed that I was aiming my videos at an intermediate or even advanced audience. I obviously had not made it clear to him that I'm an absolute rookie, so no experienced turners are likely to learn much from watching me practice. If you're in that category and you keep watching anyway, welcome. Perhaps my summaries of the keys to each essential cut will be of some value to you. My main intended audience, though, is beginners and what might be called the turning curious. If you've considered taking up turning, if you're intrigued by the idea of turning something like this into a beautiful piece like this, but you haven't gone for it because you assumed it'd be too difficult to learn, then these videos are for you. That's because my main goal is to demystify the craft of turning. Like I said, to make a bowl, you need to know only 7 different types of cuts. The technique for each of them can be boiled down to a handful of variables, which is precisely why I'm including that level of detail that led Stuart to think I'm gearing these videos toward intermediate turners. It's all about demystifying the skills. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting it's easy. Putting all those pieces together is challenging. At least that's what I'm expecting to find as I strive to develop the skills. But I also hope to demonstrate that it's a surmountable challenge. One where you can make real progress in hours or days, not months or years. While we're talking about goals, I want to make it clear that it's not my goal to teach you everything you need to know to start turning. That is, if you're new to turning, I would not want you to pick up a gouge and try your hand at this with nothing more to guide you than what you learned from these videos. Same would be true even if I were a highly skilled turner and an even more effective teacher. That's because turning is one of those tactile skills that is much better learned in person. The good news is that finding a mentor is pretty easy. Just join your local turning club. There are hundreds of them in the country. Raise your hand and say you're looking for a mentor. Not only will you learn faster at the elbow of an experienced turner, but you're less likely to develop bad habits that you'll need to unlearn later. Yeah, I know, that's not what I did, but my approach is basically an experiment for the purpose of making this series. And I assure you that as soon as I've completed this little experiment and the pandemic has broken so that my club can start meeting again, I'll be the first in line to sign on with a mentor. Well, enough talking. Let's get turning. You remember just a second ago I told you it was time for me to shut up and start turning. I forgot that I still needed to go over the particulars for the cut that we're going to be starting with here, which is to flatten off the face. This face with the rest here is going to be the top of the bowl. We'll start by flattening that off and cutting a recess for the chuck to hold it the other way around for the first phase of actually shaping the bowl. So this first cut, there's actually going to be 3 different techniques we'll be covering for how to flatten the face of the bowl, the bottom or top of the bowl. We're going to start with a peel cut using a 40-40 bowl gouge. Peeling meaning I'll be working basically like this. The particulars: stance, it's left foot forwards. Left hand position is on top of the tool reaching across the tool rest. The tool rest is parallel to the surface that I'm cutting. 2 orientation or angles for the tool itself. The vertical position is the position in this dimension. This one will, for this cut, it will be about 10 degrees down, and my right arm will be pinned to my side, not moving. The horizontal position is basically on the bevel, on the wing of this gouge, which is a 40-40 gouge. That's not quite 40 degrees, I don't think, because of the combination of angles, but about that. And at any rate, what matters is not so much the angle as the fact that you're on that wing. And the flute, this is the flute. The flute will be open to about 10:30, pointing, if this was a clock and this is noon, the flute will be pointing about 10:30, but the real critical thing there is that it's on the bevel. So I think that about covers it. The actual technique will be, I'll start with the handle a little farther down and then bring it up to find the point where the bevel starts to bite. Farther up, it doesn't have a bite yet and just rubs on the lower part below the bevel. The actual action will be entirely weight transfer. I won't be moving my arms, I'll be moving my body, and my arms and the tool will go with it. The thing I need to be most careful of here is that I'm not pushing the tool into the wood. I need to glide the bevel, float the bevel, are the terms that Stewart uses, and that means not applying pressure towards the wood. Particularly with a cut like this where the wood has not been flattened yet. There's basically going to be periods where I'm in contact with the wood and then periods where there's no wood there, so it's just air. And if I were applying pressure, it would want to dive in every time the lower spots come around, and then I make too much contact when it comes back to wood that's more proud. So that's going to be my main point of concentration, is finding that sweet spot where I'm simply holding it where the wood's going to find it when the higher wood comes around. All right, I think that does it as far as the intro goes. Time to get cutting, and if I have anything to add, we'll throw that in on voiceover. Here we go. All right, well, here we go. This is the disembodied voice of Beau the Gouge coming to you via the magic of voiceover. A little bit about myself. In my day job, I'm a software quality engineer on a video editing app that has a voiceover feature. And when I'm testing that, I often will say something inane like, "This is a test of the emergency voiceover system." In the event of an actual voiceover, I would be saying something useful. Well, we'll find out whether I can think of something useful to say here. Let's see, one thing we haven't talked about yet, I guess we haven't talked about much yet, but grain. If you're new to wood turning, first thing you need to figure out is the grain of the wood. With bowls, most bowls are made with, they're called side grain bowls. That means that the direction of the grain is perpendicular to the rotation direction. So if you imagine that piece stopped and extending out like the log that it came from, the log would be running perpendicular to the axis. So if we were to stop that, which I do not have the power to do, and you could see it, you'd see that the grain is kind of a semicircle along the side, and the part that I'm working on right here is the center of the log, with the outside of the log being on the far side, being driven by the drive head. There's a more proper term for that that's not coming to me at the moment. See if we can see the grain right there. Yeah, you kind of see a bit. Oh, gee, did I finish that one already? That can't be. All right, well, I guess so. So that was the first one. Can't believe I got it done that quick, or have I been talking that long? It went okay. It was a little bit rough, a little bit tentative, but didn't get any catches and ended up getting the surface flat. That, of course, is the main purpose here. I'm just flattening off the side of the blank. Terminology, I'll throw in some terminology as we go here. A chunk of wood that you're going to be turning into a bowl until it's a bowl, it's called a blank. And you get a big round of wood, you cut it in half on the bandsaw or with a chainsaw. You need to get rid of the pith, the very center of the wood, because that's what causes cracking. And then ideally you cut it to a round on a bandsaw. Some people do just like an octagon instead of a round, and typically you will then seal it, at least the end grain, and put it aside for it to dry.
If you turn wood when it's green, the bowl will end up moving, it's called. It doesn't stay round, in short, and that's generally not considered a good thing. Although I've done a few green bowls now since I recorded all of this, and it's interesting to see what shape they take on. But they're definitely not round anymore. All right, so we're at our first interesting point. You may have just noticed a chunk of wood came off there, and it's we're going to flip to the top view and see that again in slow motion. What happened there is there was a crack in the wood, very oblique to the angle I was turning, and the gouge caught the lip or edge of that cracked wood and tore a chunk out, which was a little bit startling, but they were small pieces of wood that didn't really risk doing any harm to me or anything. And I was able to keep going and just needed to go a little bit deeper to get down below that new cracked surface. We're now shooting along at 5x, so I'm not really working this fast. Imagine it going 5 times slower, and that's because I'm going to end up running through 15 blanks here, practicing the same maneuver over and over. And if I had not sped some of them, most of them up, we would have been here for it was almost an hour of actual turning. This is our first one that has some real bad angle to it, where I didn't get it very flat. That was bad work on the bandsaw, not the way I positioned it on the lathe. Sometimes you can adjust the position of the tailstock and the headstock, for that matter. Headstock, that's the drive end that I couldn't think of the word for before. So the headstock is the far part with the motor that's driving this, and the tailstock is the part on the bottom of the screen in this view that is just holding the other side and letting it spin, but it can't go anywhere unless something goes really wrong. So anyway, this one started off where I had done a bad job on the bandsaw. It was curved, and took a good minute or two just to take that high spot off. But it went relatively smooth. You can see here the dark part on the right side there is still has the wood sealer on it. You can also see there, I was talking before a minute ago about taking the pith out. I'll come back to that very quickly. You could see the pith in the wood side of the wood there. But that one I ended up taking out of the operation because it was had a bad crack in it, and I decided it just was not going to be safe to continue with it. So that's the first retiree of the 20 or so blanks that I had set aside to start this whole process. And we're back up to 5x speed. I'm starting to get the hang of it here. You can see I'm way less tentative, able to just dive in and start taking wood off at a reasonably good clip and bringing it down to flat fairly quickly. This is not a particularly difficult operation. I was talking before about the grain and how the grain of the wood, the end grain is on the sides that I'm not touching right now. Let's see, sides. How do you define sides? The outside of the circle is where the end grain is. So here I'm working with side grain, and side grain is way easier to work with. You can peel side grain. There's a first Founder sighting. Founder's my dog there, and you'll see him come on through occasionally. He's a McNabb, a kind of border collie. Good dog. There he goes again, heading back out into the yard. So the side grain you can peel. You can put a blade to it, point it uphill, and the wood will just peel away. Far less chance of a catch when you're working with side grain. And so here I'm using the wing of the gouge. Wish we were in a top view right here. Oh, okay, we're going to be slowing down here, I think. And this piece, notice there, that is some crazy grain.
Crazy grain.
There's some kind of a knot or the like around there, and the grain is all twisted up. So this block I'm going to set aside. I'm not taking it out of the rotation altogether, but we'll come back to this one with the other techniques for flattening the end. The technique that I'm using here is fine when you're dealing with straight grain, but when you start getting curly grain in there, it's better to use the other two techniques that we'll be coming to in the next episode. So there you can see the wing against the face that I'm cutting, and if I'm doing it right, I'm on the bevel, meaning that the outside edge is fairly straight to the surface I'm cutting, and that's a peel. When we get to the next major operation, which is going to be turning it down to the round, we'll talk about where we'll be working with end grain, and that's a completely different beast. Have to be way more careful anytime there's end grain in the equation. So this is the second day I was working on this operation. You may have noticed a change in the camera angles. The low angle here is a little bit farther back, and which I don't think worked out quite as well as I thought it would. The top angle I moved farther away from me, so I would stop sticking my head in front of the camera. Wish I had moved it a little bit farther toward the block so we were looking more straight down on it, but this is all right. All right, 12 down up to 13. I believe I'm working, the first few pieces I did were all oak. They were from basically the wood pile that the last owners of our house left behind. So it was essentially firewood. Had not been treated. You know, ideally when you harvest wood that you plan to turn, you're going to set it aside and like I said, rough it out. Put the end grain sealer onto it, and then set it aside in good conditions and let it dry for a period of years. Typically, the rule of thumb I've heard is 1 year per inch of wood plus 1 year. So if your piece of wood is say 4 inches thick, you'd give it 4 years for each, or 4 years, one for each inch, and then another year for good measure. This stuff, we bought this house in 2007, and in making doing this turning in 2020. So, it had sat around 13 years just since I know about it. No idea how long it had sat around for the previous owners. But like I say, it hadn't been roughed down, hadn't been end grain sealed, and it had a fair number of cracks, which means I probably shouldn't have been turning it, and we're going to see the results of my decision to go ahead and turn it anyway in the next couple of episodes. But we're now into olive wood, and you can see there a little bit right under my hand. It has some beautiful grain to it. Fortunately, all of the bowls that I made for this series out of walnut, I guess I might be ruining some of the suspense here, but the 4 pieces of olive that I worked here all survived. None of them are perfect by a long stretch, but they at least made it through to the finish line, and they're worth keeping. I've slowed it down to regular speed here for blank number 14. We only have one more to go after it. It was a quick one, and I just wanted to let you see how I was doing after, doing about a dozen, because remember I put 2 of them aside without getting very far. But here I am, basically a dozen blanks in, and working with a reasonable confidence and getting the wood off of there in good shape and pretty quickly. So this operation I can now do in probably 2 minutes from the time I put a blank onto the lathe until I have the end flattened, is at most a couple of minutes, and ready then to cut the recess for flipping it over and mounting it on a chuck, which will be a couple of episodes from now, since the next one is going over the other 2 techniques for flattening the end. Other 2 techniques that I'm going to be covering. I'm sure there are, 10, 15, 20 other ways you can do this same thing. And I gather some turners don't even bother with this step because they mount on a faceplate or use some other technique for the first main phase of turning other than putting it on a chuck. But I like the idea of putting it on a chuck and having a good grip on the thing. Never been a fan of using a faceplate. Maybe somebody will convince me that they're just fine, but I feel like the chuck has a much better chance of keeping the wood solidly held and on the lathe. I think we're about done with this one, and at that point we'll go back into high speed 5x for the final blank made of a chunk of pear wood. The pear came from a tree that my mom had taken down about 3 or 4 years ago, and again I did not, I had the guy who took it down set chunks aside for me, thinking I'd want to turn them, and I did not do anything with it right away, and it turns out pear cracks pretty badly if it's not treated properly. Understand it can be beautiful wood to turn, but I don't think one piece of the pear that I eventually roughed out and end grain sealed, I don't think any of it is going to survive. It has big old cracks, 2 or 3 of them per blank. Just not worth messing with. And I think I end up retiring. I think I had 3 or 4 in the mix, and ended up tossing them all before we got close to actually hollowing out and so forth. So man, look at that grain. Isn't that pretty? As we blow through this last blank using the peeling technique, time to share a change of plans. You may recall that I had mentioned a couple times that the other two techniques for flattening the end would be covered in the second episode. Well, for reasons that I'm not going to bore you with, we're going to squeeze them in at the end of this episode. I'm going to keep it short and just do 2 blanks with one technique and 1 blank with the other. And I'll include a link to the main video where Stuart covers these 2 techniques in case you want to see more of it. Now, I should probably explain that for the next couple of minutes, we're going to be looking at a freeze frame of me in position to start one of these cuts. That's because I apparently neglected to record the intro for these 2 techniques. Either that or I lost the clip along the way. Anyway, I don't have that video to show, so I had to throw something up there. Now, just to review a little bit, the technique that we just finished, the peeling cut with the wing of the bowl gouge, that's great when the blank has straight grain because it's fine to peel uphill into side grain. But if the blank has curly wood, whether it's just wavy grain or burl or whatever results in the end grain making an appearance on this face that we're flattening, that technique will no longer work because you simply cannot point an edge uphill into end grain and avoid a catch. So that's where these other 2 techniques come in. They can deal with the end grain making an appearance because you're not pointing uphill into it. So the first one we're going to cover it involves a series of cuts basically pushing straight into the face that we're flattening. It's very similar to the technique we just finished in most of the particulars. We're still using the same 40-40 bowl gouge. Foot position is different. The feet are parallel to the bed of the lathe instead of left foot forward. The tool rest is parallel to the end just like it was. Hand position, left hand position is the same with the hand on top of the tool reaching over the tool rest. Vertical and horizontal tool angle are the same. Vertical is slightly uphill, about 10 degrees, and the horizontal angle is about 40 degrees from the end face with the edge of the wing in contact. The flute angle is the main difference here, and it is much more closed than it was in the prior technique, where the prior technique was doing a peeling action with the bevel in contact with the wood. Here we're using a scraping action, and so you're going to want the flute turned to about 930, and the key here is to get the inside face of the left wing about horizontal, and that gives you the scraping action. The technique is pretty simple. You're keeping your right arm locked to the side of your body, and your main motion then is a slight weight transfer from the right foot to the left foot, just pushing the tool straight into the face, and then pull it out and move farther in or farther out depending which direction you're going, towards center or towards edge, and repeat. And you do that until you've gotten it flattened out across the entire face, and then you can do a light sweeping motion in the same position, but forward and back, where you're doing a very light scraping action to smooth things out. That about covers it. So let's go away from this freeze frame and roll the film. We're jumping in here with the second blank that I tried this technique on. I'm going to show you the second and the fourth. And I should fess up here that this is not a technique I got comfortable with. I think I only did about 5 or 6 blanks, maybe 7 blanks this way. And I get the job done, but it's not a comfortable way for me to work. Maybe with more practice, but I think it also is harder on the tool. I think the scraping action tends to dull the tool more than a slicing action. Also, it's worth pointing out that the chunks of wood I'm using here are not much of a challenge for this. I only had one piece with the kind of grain where this technique was an advantage over the peeling operation. And that one I'm going to use with the technique we'll cover next. Here I only had the overhead angle. For some reason my iPhone video didn't come through. And you can see just a series of cuts straight into the face. And then when I'm done there, I'll draw the tool lightly across the face to give it a smooth finish. It works, just not the way I'll be working normally. So there's 2 examples of that technique. Refer to Stuart Batty if you want to see more. And that brings us to the second technique for dealing with curved grain when we're flattening the end, which uses a completely different tool known as a bottom bowl gouge, also in some circles called a bottom feeder. This is a very different tool from a standard bowl gouge. The profile is different. The way that it's ground is different. It doesn't have swept back wings like a 40-40 bowl gouge or other profiles of standard bowl gouges. And it has a much more blunt angle on the bevel. About 60 degrees is ideal here. And this allows it to work across a face in a much different way that isn't as prone to catching the end grain. We'll be returning to this tool for the, I don't know which episode, 6, 7, I don't know, but where we're basically shaping the bottom third of the bowl, and that's where this tool really earns its keep. But it's also good for platters, and in this case for flattening the end of a blank that has curved wood. So you know what the tool is, the bottom bowl gouge. We're going to actually jump into the video here, and I'll give you the rest of the details, the rest of the particulars as we get moving in the interest of time. The stance is left foot forward. Tool rest, as you see, is parallel to the end as it has been, and the left hand position is still reaching over the top and holding down, just applying pressure on the top. In this case, you want your fingers kind of draped over the front of it, and just make sure that you're not putting any pressure on the back of the tool and pushing the tool with the left hand. There's a real temptation to do that, and I think I was doing that pretty routinely when I was practicing for this particular operation. The vertical tool angle is a little bit more uphill than it has been, 15, maybe even 20 degrees uphill. The horizontal angle is not angled as far back because the bevel is only 60 degrees instead of 45. In order to stay on the bevel, you're going to be angling it from perpendicular, you're only going to be angling it back about 30 degrees. The flute angle is not terribly important, not real critical here, because of the profile of the tool being pretty uniform regardless of the angle, but we're going to aim for being at 130. Left wing just past 12 o'clock. And the technique you can see is, well, you can't see what my right arm is doing really, but I'm trying to maintain body contact with that, my elbow pinned to my hip. And the main action then is a simple weight transfer from my rear right foot to my front left foot. And the thing to really focus on here, which I was not doing a particularly good job on at this point, is you really need to trust the bevel here. Just looking at it, and thinking about it, it seems like you're going to have to push this tool with your left hand in order to get it to move. And that's just not the case. If you trust the bevel and you simply apply pressure straight down the tool with the right hand, that tool will move forward. And, taking wood out as it goes. And that it took, I think I did 6 or 7 blanks using this technique to flatten the end. And I'm pretty sure that all the way along I was using my left hand more than I should have been, not just for weight on the tool, but actually giving a bit of push. So that's something to really focus on as you're trying your hand at using the bottom bowl gouge in this fashion. So that does it for the orientation to this technique. Let's see what else I have to say here in the remainder of the time we have with this blank and with this episode. This blank I mentioned with the last technique is the one that I had set aside during the first run using the peeling technique, because I found that it had the curved grain and was really tearing out. And I'm pleased with how it worked here. I'm clearly not a master of this technique, but at least for purposes of getting the face flattened without major tear out, using the bottom bowl gouge here did a pretty good job. It cut through there without catches, without bad tears. We're going to see that there are a couple of areas I didn't go deep enough to take them all the way out. There's 2, flaws in the wood that went pretty deep there. One around the particular problem area, and the other on more or less the other side of the chunk of wood. And I think I just got tired and didn't want to go any farther with it. But overall, we'll see that the piece got reasonably well flattened, and despite being a challenging piece and my first time trying this technique, I got decent results. Overall, over the 5 other pieces or 4 other pieces that I used this technique with, none of them really required it because they weren't curved grain, that is. But I had a long way to go as far as developing a real comfort with this technique. But at the very least, it works. We're going to slow down here and zoom in a bit, and you can see that it's pretty badly flawed, but that's not a product of tear out. That's just areas in the wood that were more or less rotten. We've gone high speed here for the last segment, and then we'll come back to regular speed just to see how it turned out before I finally gave up on this one. I guess this is where I'm supposed to implore you to click the little like button and subscribe and give me 10 stars on IMDb and however else you might help me to get more people watching. And thank you for watching, and see you maybe on the next episode. Cheers.